So this is just a quick video reacting to today's weigh-in between David Haye and Tony Bellew. David Haye weighed in at 224 pounds and 9 ounces, so somewhere between 16 stone 1 and 16 stone flat. Now, I heard David Haye say in an interview that he's about 9% body fat, and I'm no sports scientist, I'm no personal trainer, but looking at him today on the scales, I can fully believe that he was 9% body fat. He looked very lean, very fit, very strong, very well conditioned. David Haye at one point could make cruiserweight, that's a fact. But the David Haye I saw on the scales today no longer was a guy who could make cruiserweight, and that's probably been the case for some time, by the way. I'm not saying this is a recent development, but David Haye's assertion that he's in against, Tony Bellew's assertion that he's in against the big cruiserweight is flatly incorrect. That David Haye today, if he lost another half stone, if he was down to 15.5 stone, he wouldn't be healthy for me, because he came to that weigh-in at 16 stone. Very, very lean, very well conditioned indeed. A number of people were buying the hype. I had a few comments on previous videos. They were buying the stuff Tony Bellew was saying, that David Haye looked like he'd shrunk. To me, I never necessarily believed that. David Haye, I saw him myself relatively recently, and I thought he'd grown, actually. I thought the other way. I thought he'd got bigger rather than got smaller, if anything else. And the guy I saw today was a legit heavyweight, and clearly was taking this fight very, very seriously. I know muscles don't win fights. I know having a six-pack and looking like an Abercrombie and Fitch model doesn't necessarily make you the best boxer in the world. And I know David Haye's probably got very, very good genetics, because he's always looked in shape throughout the entirety of his career. But you don't get in the shape David Haye was in today if you're simply doing yoga, going out night clubbing and drinking cocktails in a jacuzzi. Let's not believe the hype, people. David Haye has trained very hard for this fight. David Haye has got himself in prime physical condition, and David Haye is ready for battle tomorrow. Tony Bellew, he weighed in at 213. Now, my first instinct on this was 213 was very, very heavy. For me, Tony Bellew doesn't necessarily win this fight by competing with David Haye for size. I've never seen Tony Bellew as a guy with a frame that could rival David Haye's in terms of size. Tony Bellew, not too distant past, was able to get his frame down to 175. David Haye could never get his frame down to 175. Tony Bellew's a smaller man physically than David Haye, in my opinion. Let's have it right. But Tony Bellew at 213, my initial instinct was that was high, and that he was coming in a bit too heavy for my liking. I possibly thought he'd come in somewhere between 205 and 210. I kind of feel that an extra 13 pounds over the cruiserweight limit of needless weight, be it fat, be it water weight, however you want to phrase it, an extra 13 pound on top of the cruiserweight Tony Bellew, I don't think is going to be beneficial. Bellew's already outgunned for size. Bellew's already outgunned for speed. I'm just not so sure that adding an extra stone into that equation is necessarily helpful. Bellew's best chance in this fight is taking the fight late and trying to come on strong and show great stamina at the end of the fight, and show his good engine that he's shown in the past. And I just wonder if throwing an extra stone into the mix is necessarily the right tactic here. I always feel when fighters move up a weight class, and I felt this when Kell Brook fought Gennady Golovkin, for example, that just because you've got a whole weight class to play with, it doesn't mean you've got to weigh in at the top of the weight class. Now, clearly, Tony Bellew didn't weigh in as a big heavyweight, don't get me wrong, but the fight was made at 200 pounds plus. He could have weighed in at 201 pounds. The fact he's weighed in at 213, for me, initially, and I've changed my opinion on this slightly now, but initially I thought it was a little bit of a concern, because, realistically, Bellew was never a fantastically conditioned athlete at cruiserweight. He was always a guy who carried a lot of body fat and came to the ring not looking in the best of shape. But as I've said previously, you don't have to necessarily be some sort of men's health cover model in order to be a great heavyweight boxer. So, I'm not getting it twisted there, but at the same time, it's a balance, isn't it? You don't have to be an Anthony Joshua physique, but you can't be a Butterbean physique if you want to be taken seriously. And seeing Tony Bellew today laughing about his physique on the scales and rubbing his belly, it just made me feel potentially he may be miscalculated by coming in at 213. Having considered it at length, I happen to know that Bellew does cut weight to make cruiserweight. I've been to Bellew weigh-ins, and sometimes if you go to weigh-ins, before the weigh-ins start, you'll notice boxers coming out and having a test weigh-in on the scales. And I was at the weigh-in where Bellew fought Masterneck, and I saw him come out twice and have a test weigh-in. He was obviously just teetering over that 200-pound mark, and he's trying to lose weight in the last 30 minutes or something like that. Anyway, he came out, weighed in at 200 pounds, and I saw him necking water after the weigh-in. So Bellew's clearly a guy who in the past has got into fights, cruiserweight fights at 200 pounds, well in excess of 200 pounds. And I perhaps naively thought maybe he was coming in at 205 or 206 or something like that. But maybe, just maybe, Bellew is actually fighting at 213 anyway. I guess for a guy who fights at cruiserweight, to put on a stone between weigh-in and fight night isn't actually impossible. Now, it seems high to me for Bellew to be 213, given that he was a light heavyweight up till relatively recently. The difference between 175 pounds and 213 pounds is relatively vast. That's a 38 pound gap. That's best part of 3 stone in British money. So that is a vast difference there. But maybe 213 is Bellew's natural weight. Maybe 213 is what he normally enters the ring at. So perhaps my initial response that 213 was high was perhaps incorrect. I'm not sure. But I guess we'll find out on fight night. And there is a size difference between these two. But it's never necessarily been a fight where I've felt that the size difference is going to be the deciding factor. Because I don't know. Right now, I'm probably a light heavyweight. If I fought a world champion lightweight, they'd knock me out in 30 seconds. And, that's an extreme example. But, I think the gap in, what I'm getting at is I think the gap in class between Haye and Bellew is so vast that it doesn't necessarily mean, that perhaps the weights are, what I'm getting at is I don't think a pound here or a pound there necessarily matters. In a real tight fight, a real 50-50 fight, you look for every advantage and angle. But here I think it's so one-sided that, I'm just not so sure that the weigh-ins will make a difference. So, anyway, just wanted to do a quick video on that. Paulie Malignaggi versus Sam Eggington. That was another one that caught my eye. A vast size difference there. Paulie's a tiny welterweight. I've been to Malignaggi. I've seen Malignaggi weigh in live at 147 as well. And, he's a very small guy at the weight. Very small. I mean, certainly he looks like a light welterweight, if not even a lightweight. He's small in height, small in build. And funnily enough, I know he struggles to make the weight, so I don't know why that is, but he looked very small next to Sam Eggington. Eggington's a big guy though, and he's still only 23, unbelievably, so maybe in time Eggington will have to step up to 154, because, clearly as you get older, you get a bit heavier and it's harder to make lower weight classes. And prime examples of that, Paulie Malignaggi, David Haye and Tony Bellew, all of whom have stepped up in weight classes as they've got older. And I suspect the same thing will happen with Sam Eggington, at some point in his career. Just wanted to pump out a quick video really on the weigh-ins today. I'm interested for your take though on this Tony Bellew weigh-in. 213, is my initial take that 213 is too high, correct? Or is my secondary take correct, that actually that may even be Bellew's normal fighting weight, so actually it doesn't really make much of a difference? As for David Haye, all of this talk about David Haye shrinking, I think that's completely incorrect. But drop me a comment, let me know what you guys think. What were you impressed by the condition of the Haymaker today? I thought he looked in prime physical condition, and it suggests to me that he's in very, very good nick. There was a bit of beef at the weigh-in today between Bryant Jennings and Dillian White, which is interesting. You know what? In fact, I'll actually do a separate video on that because I think that's an interesting discussion. So, yeah, stay tuned to the channel and check out that video. It'll be up probably about half an hour after this one. Hit the subscribe button so you can check that video out and other videos. I'll be doing a lot on the channel for this fight week. I'll probably go live tomorrow to do some commentary on some of the earlier undercard fights. I'll do a post-fight video on David Haye after that matchup, and maybe we'll even go live after and do like a sort of post-fight wrap-up. So we'll have to see. But yeah, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out any of the coverage tomorrow night. And if you've enjoyed this video, do take the time to hit the thumbs up. And as always, share it on social media. My Facebook and Twitter profile are in the section below. So cheers, guys. Thanks for watching.